I still remember the sound. It wasn't just the crack of stone. It was a raw, sudden silence that followed, like the world had swallowed its breath. A chunk of limestone smashed into the flagstones where I had been standing seconds before. Dust rose in a gray cloud that smelled faintly of old mortar and something like cold rain. My knees buckled before my brain registered it. My heart pounded so hard I could feel each beat against my ribs, and for a moment the only thing I heard was that pulse, like a drum under my shirt. It was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday. I've lived my Sundays the same way for more than 40 years. Wake at 6. The old percolator Henry gave me on our 30th anniversary, wheezing out coffee that tasted like home. A cardigan folded over a skirt, the reading glasses on their cord, the little bits of armor I wear to stand at the church desk. Millfield in October smells like damp leaves and wood smoke. Main Street was bright with maples. People nod when they pass. People here know your child's name, your neighbor's dog, how you take your coffee. Gregory found me in the empty parking lot. He was cursing under his breath, keys jangling at his belt. The sound of those keys has been part of the church's rhythm for as long as I can remember. He looked older in the morning light, shoulders hunched like he'd been carrying the world in his hands. "Margaret," he said, voice low, almost apologetic. "You need to see something in the archive. Now." We went down the narrow steps into the musty room where the air smelled of paper and old varnish. It was cold, the kind of cold that sits in your bones. Papers were spread across the oak table. Receipts, bank statements, transfer confirmations. The smell of toner and old glue made my throat tighten. My fingers trembled when I picked up the page that should never have existed. A wire to the Caymans, $300,000 from the fund for our community center. I felt the reading glasses slip down my nose. My throat made a small dry sound. Gregory's hand was on the back of my chair. He looked at me as if the ground had shifted under him. "Pastor Warren's been moving money for years," he whispered. He didn't say it like he wanted to be dramatic. He said it like a man naming a thing that's true and terrible. His lower lip trembled. His knuckles were white on the table. The keys at his belt clicked when he shifted, a small nervous percussion. I folded one of the pages and tucked it into my coat pocket. I don't know why I did it, protection maybe, or because Henry used to say we keep things close until we can make sense of them. The paper rustled against my hand as we climbed back into daylight. The courtyard was busier now. The scaffolding ringed the bell tower in a half embrace. There was the faint metallic smell of the ladders and the citrus sting of the cleaning solvent they'd used on the pews. Voices rose and fell like a choir warming up. "Margaret!" Eliza's voice sliced through the hum. She reached for my elbow with 2 fingers, a practiced gesture of concern. Her perfume smelled like roses and a lifetime of social calendars. "You look off." Her smile was tight. I wanted to tell her everything. Instead I forced a small, polite smile and felt my jaw go numb. Then I saw him, Pastor Warren, walking across the courtyard, a group of men trailing respectfully. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. Tailored suit, cufflinks catching the sun, that steady practiced smile. For 28 years, he had been our comfort and compass. He'd taken Henry's hand when the cancer worsened, had baptized my grandchildren. To see him now felt like sensing a shadow fall across a familiar painting. He stopped short when he saw us. For a heartbeat we held each other's eyes. His much darker than I remembered. He cleared his throat. "Council in 15, Margaret," he announced, loud enough that other voices dropped a notch. "We need to go over some irregularities in the accounts you've handled." It was surgical. There it was, a blade sliding across my name. The breath left me. My hands went cool. The paper in my pocket seemed to grow heavier. Around us people glanced. A child started to cry. Someone's heel clicked too loudly on the stone. Gregory's voice, small and urgent, pulled me aside. "And stay clear of the tower," he said. He pointed to the base where I had been standing. He touched my arm, his hands calloused and steady. "There are loose stones. Someone should have fixed it before all these folks came." I took a step back, obeying without thinking. The wind shifted. A chill crawled up my neck, as if something was watching. And then the stone fell. It hit the ground with a violence that made everyone gasp. The dust tasted of limestone in the back of my throat. People screamed. I felt hot and cold at once, a pressure behind my eyes like someone had folded time in two. Pastor Warren was in front of me before I could move. He took my arm with a grip that felt both familiar and foreign. His smile was the same pastoral smile, soothing, rehearsed. "Come into my office, Margaret," he said softly. "We need to speak about the accounts." His hand on my elbow was a claim. His words were a redirect. Around us, the congregation stuttered into motion, forming circles, asking questions, searching for explanation. Gregory kept shouting, "That was deliberate." But his voice was swallowed by the crowd. When he led me inside, the hallway smelled of lemon cleaner and old hymnals. His office window looked down over the courtyard. He closed the door with a small, decisive click. For an instant I was a child again, waiting while a grown-up decided what truth I would be allowed to hold. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I reached into my coat and felt the folded paper there. It was a little thing, but it carried years, our money, our promises. And as he sat across from me, Bible on his lap like a shield, I understood that I had a choice: retreat and let the story be written for me, or make the sound of my own truth loud enough to be heard over the roar. The bell began to toll in the distance, low and steady, and I made up my mind. The stone crashed down with a terrifying roar, shattering just inches from where I had stood seconds before. My knees buckled. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, so loud it drowned out even the screams in the churchyard. "It was a sign from God," someone whispered. I looked up at the old bell tower and saw Pastor Warren's pale face watching from the window. He knew. I knew. And the document hidden in my pocket would change everything. My dears, thank you for taking these precious minutes to listen. This channel is still in its early steps, and every new subscriber is a breath of life. We're trying to reach our first 1,000. If this story touches you, please subscribe and tell me in the comments which town you're watching from. It helps more than I can say. The morning light used to arrive like a benediction through my kitchen window. It would catch on the chipped rim of Henry's old percolator, make the coffee steam look like a thin, holy smoke rising. I'd stand there, cup cupped in both hands, the warmth soaking into my palms, and listen to the town waking up. The distant rumble of Route 9, Mrs. Alvarez's dog barking 2 doors down, and the first soft toll of the church bell that always marked my day. At 68, those small things were my anchor. Henry used to joke that I had a liturgy of my own. Wake at 6. Fold the cardigan across my shoulders. Slide the reading glasses onto the cord that hangs like a rosary from my neck. Put on the sensible shoes. Tuck my wedding ring where it belonged, always on my left hand, and walk the 5 blocks down Main Street. The walk was a procession. Nods from shopkeepers, a wave to the veterans on the corner. The crunch of October leaves underfoot. Millfield smelled like wood smoke and wet earth then. Comforting, familiar, as if faith itself had a scent. At the church my role was small but steady. For 20 years I kept the desk, the ledgers, the condolence cards that people slid across the oak when sorrow came. I knew where every hymnal lived, which pews held the oldest knees, which elder liked the hymns slow. I dusted the brass candle holders on the altar until they gleamed. That brass candle, a little thing with a dent on the rim from some long ago rehearsal, sat there week after week, a quiet witness to promises and mornings like this. Behind the pulpit the curtain was a deep, worn crimson, the color softened by years of sunlight and hands. It always struck me as odd that something so bright could look tired. Perhaps that was how institutions grew old with their people. There's a pew near the front window that has been empty for 2 years. We never moved the little knitted cushion Henry used to sit on. People asked about it sometimes. On quiet weekday afternoons, when the rector's office was empty and the smell of lemon cleaner lingered, I'd sit with the ledgers and let the house settle around me. The sound of the bell would drift in low and clear, and I would feel it in my chest like a heartbeat. Sometimes I'd run my finger down the column of figures and think of the folks behind them. The Thompsons who lost their house in '09, the Carters who held soup kitchens in winter. The community center fund was a dream we had all shared. A place where kids could learn to paint and elders could meet for lunch, where summer campouts could be planned without scraping for donations. Those plans showed up on the wall like sticky notes and prayer requests. There were flyers tacked to the bulletin board for bake sales and a faded poster of the centennial celebration pinned beside a photograph of the old choir. The scaffolding photographs were there, 2 black and white snapshots of men in hard hats, smiling, hopeful. They felt like promises waiting their turn. Faith for me was never blind. It was a series of small acts. Folding a bulletin the right way, listening to someone's confession over the coffee urn, making room for the stranger at potluck. I trusted people because I wanted to believe the church was a safe place. Pastor Warren's sermons about honesty and sacrifice had rung true to me for years. He had baptized my grandchildren, had held my hand during Henry's last night. His voice from the pulpit had soothed me through storms. That's why the idea that anything could be wrong felt like a crack appearing in the stained glass. A slow, terrible spreading. In the days before the courtyard filled with voices and before the bell tower shook dust into the air, I was thinking of details. The ledger that needed a new ribbon, the columbarium plaque that needed polishing, the cushion I would tuck for Henry. I tucked my hand into my coat pocket most mornings, more out of habit than fear, feeling for the small folded hymnal I kept close. Small objects keep us steady. A coin in a pocket, a note in a Bible. Sometimes even the invisible weight of duty is an object of its own. Looking back now, those ordinary mornings were a prelude. The little brass candle caught the sunlight, the crimson curtain hung heavy and familiar, and an empty pew kept its vigil. I walked among those things like someone who believes the world will remain as arranged. I had no idea that a ledger, a loose stone, and the decision to keep faith with truth would soon rearrange everything. The bell, which had always been a comfort, would become the sound that forced me awake. But on those autumn mornings, I still moved through the rituals, breathing in the coffee steam, listening to the bell, holding tight to the small steady things. The sound hit me before my mind could catch up. It wasn't just the crack of falling stone. It was the blunt punctuation of something impossible happening. A chunk of limestone exploded into dust on the flagstones where I had been standing seconds before. The air filled with that clean, bitter smell of mortar and cold rain. My knees gave way before I thought to bend them. My heart felt like it was trying to climb out of my chest. Each beat a drum under my ribs. For a moment the world narrowed to the sound of my pulse, and the white grit settling on my cardigan. People were shouting somewhere behind the spray of dust. Gregory was at my elbow with hands that shook more than usual. He kept saying, "You stepped back. You stepped back," as if saying it hard enough could rewrite the seconds that had nearly ended me. Pastor Warren was at the second-floor window of the bell tower, a pale face in a dark frame. Our eyes met. There was no surprise there, only that practiced calm he wore for the congregation, the look of a man who knows how to be believed. For 28 years that face had been an anchor for this town. That look felt like a verdict. He cleared his throat in the courtyard, loud enough that the murmurs quieted into attention. "Council in 15, Margaret," he announced as if reading off a schedule. "We need to go over some irregularities in the accounts you've handled." The words slid across me like ice. My name felt foreign in his mouth. In that instant the ledger I had kept for decades, every envelope, every bingo ticket, every trembling donation, was made into something suspect. I could feel the paper in my pocket, a folded sheet that had the weight of years. My fingers went cold where it rested against my palm. Gregory's voice was a rasp at my side. "Stay clear of the tower," he said. He touched my arm the way he'd touched the bell rope for 40 years, steady, familiar. "Loose stones. Don't stand there." His hand smelled of oil and old dust. I stepped back, obeying without thinking. The wind moved through the scaffolding with a metallic hiss. A chill crawled up my neck like a warning. When the stone fell, it was as if the ground gave up on me. For a beat I could only hear my own breathing, sharp, too fast. The kids in the crowd were crying. Someone began to pray out loud, voice wobbling. "It was a sign from God," someone whispered, and the words landed like accusation. Pastor Warren was at my side before I understood movement. His hand on my elbow was that same comforting gesture he'd used at funerals and weddings. But now it felt like something else, an attempt to steer, to control the narrative. "Come to my office, Margaret," he said quietly, the kind of soft that gathers someone's compliance. "We need to speak about these irregularities." The hallway smelled of lemon polish and old hymnals. The office window looked down on the courtyard where people clustered and pointed and whispered. He closed the door with a small, decisive click. The noise inside the small room, the clock, his steady breathing, the leather of his Bible, shrank until it was all I could hear. My hands were cold and slick. My reading glasses swung on their cord against my chest. I touched my wedding ring without thinking, felt the familiar bump where Henry's palm used to rest. I could taste dust at the back of my throat. The folded paper in my coat pocket felt like a beating thing, like a promise or a weapon. Every lesson I'd ever had about trust hummed in my bones. That stewardship is sacred. That faithful accounting honors the giving of neighbors. I had kept those ledgers because money is not numbers to me. It's people's names, their hunger and hope. Pastor Warren sat across from me with a Bible open between us as if to make the room holy. He spoke in that calm, rehearsed cadence. He framed questions to unsettle rather than to inquire. He placed doubt where there had been none. My breathing tightened into small, jagged sounds. I felt a knot climb my throat, a pressure behind my sternum that made words stick. The choice didn't feel like a choice at first. I could feel the town's eyes already turning, the gossip forming like a storm front. I could imagine the whispered assumptions, the tilt of heads, the way people protect themselves by believing quick answers. Saying nothing would let the story be written for me. Staying quiet would preserve a false peace and my good name only in appearance. It would betray the very people who had entrusted their small, brave gifts to the future we were building. I reached into my pocket. The paper was warmer than the air. My fingers trembled when I unfolded it. Gregory's face flashed across the top of the page for a moment, the way he had stood over the table in the archive. His mouth a thin line, his eyes hollow with something like grief. I could hear Henry's voice too, in memory, small and practical. "Keep what you know, love. Make it right." The bell somewhere in the distance began a slow toll, a low sound that felt like the heartbeat of the whole town. My hands were steady enough for the first time that morning. I left the office and walked back through the crowd. People parted like water, some staring, some stepping closer. I handed the folded sheets to whoever was nearest. Eliza first, because she would read everything and then compose the right face for the rest of the world. A young deacon took the next copy with shaking fingers. Gregory made a small noise, relief or fear I could not tell, and then he went to fetch the others. Words began to spread, quick and sharp as a bell. Conversations erupted, then stilled. Someone said, "Caymans," as if that single syllable could hold the whole truth. The sheriff's cruiser came like a slow mercy, lights blinking without sound. Pastor Warren's face, which had seemed carved of the old certainty, finally showed something like panic. When they closed the case that afternoon, it wasn't by my choice alone. But in that hour, with the stone's fresh dust still on the flagstones, I realized what courage looked like for someone who'd spent her life keeping small trusts. It looked like unfolding a single sheet of paper and letting the truth weigh the scales instead of my silence. The office smelled of lemon polish and old paper. His Bible lay open on the desk like an accusation. I sat opposite him and felt every small thing that had ever been steady in my life. The clock on the wall ticked with its usual calm patience. My pulse did not keep its patience. The paper in my pocket pressed against my palm like a small living thing. I could feel dust from the courtyard still in my throat. My fingers found the wedding band without thinking. Thumb rubbing the worn edge where Henry's hand had once been steady. "You called me in like a sheep," I said before I had time to soften it. The words surprised me with their plainness. He blinked, the barest lift of those practiced lids, and there was a flicker, just a flicker of irritation. He had no right to that. His voice softened. "This is a matter for the council, Margaret. We must be transparent." Transparent. The word hung between us like a pane of glass. I looked at him. Up close, the lines at the corner of his eyes were sharper. His cufflinks flashed. I remembered him at Henry's funeral, hands clasped, voice steady. I remembered baptisms, potlucks, the way he would hand me a casserole and a smile. The past pressed against my ribs in the shape of loyalty. "Gregory found these in the archive," I said. "Not me." My throat was dry. He gave the smallest tilt of the head, the kind that said he accepted the narrative I offered, but his fingers tightened on the Bible for a moment, too quick to be seen if you weren't watching. Outside, voices rose and fell like a tide. The bell tower seemed to hold its breath. I could hear Eliza's shoes clicking down the hallway, always the click before the words. When she entered, her perfume came like roses poured over linen. She arranged herself on the edge of the visitor chair, as if setting a place at a table. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Is Margaret all right?" she asked, but the question was a costume. She tilted her head to take in my coat, the dust on my cardigan, the way my hands wouldn't rest. I handed her the folded sheet without preamble. Her fingers brushed mine. There was a split second when her nails, carefully manicured, pressed too firmly against the paper. She did not meet my eyes. Instead, she smoothed the skirt of her dress, the little ritual of returning order to whatever chaos might look like. Pastor Warren watched every small move and logged it like a clerk. "Council in 15 minutes, he said again. "We will address this properly." He said properly as if he were offering comfort, but his jaw set like a trap. There was a stillness about him now I hadn't noticed before. An animal quiet, one that told me he had a plan for how the story would be handled. I felt the room tilt, like a stage resetting itself for a different show. Gregory's arrival was raw relief. He came in with his keys jangling, oil still on his palms, his left foot catching the rug the way it does when he carries too much. He looked at the papers on the table and then at my face. The man who had spent 40 years tending boilers and bells, who smelled of rope and sweat and honest labor, let himself make a small animal sound, half laugh, half sob. His hand found mine and squeezed. His knuckles were white where they gripped. "Someone moved those papers," he said. He didn't need to say who. The accusation hung heavy. Not like a rumor but like a thing you can hold in your hands. Pastor Warren's eyes narrowed just enough for me to see the calculation. "Who else knew of this account?" he asked. His tone was almost clinical. That was the thing with him. He could teach you to hear a question and feel like the question was a benediction. But underneath the gentleness was a keenness. "Eliza answered before I could. Only Gregory and Margaret touched the archives in recent weeks," she said. And her voice had that practiced neutrality of someone used to smoothing creases in public life. Her hand fluttered to the brooch on her lapel, an old needlepoint of a pumpkin fall perfect. I could see her measure distance between us, like someone spacing china on a shelf. Silence came like a curtain. I felt every eye in the room, not loud, just focused like a spotlight. I could feel the weight of years. The people who had trusted me with ledgers and condolence notes were imagining their small donations evaporating into someone else's pockets. Their faces read like hymnals, open, hopeful, then folded in grief. He leaned forward and there was steam in his gaze. If anyone has done anything wrong, he said slowly, they will be dealt with appropriately. His hands were a study in contradiction, one moment open, the next closed. I watched his mouth as he spoke, the tiny twitch that told me he had rehearsed every syllable. The pastor's voice was meant to soothe, but that day it had steel in it. It struck me that for all the sermons on sacrifice and honesty, he had learned to wear piety like armor. I had a photograph in my mind of Henry at the potluck table, hands full of meatloaf, laughing with a lipstick smear on his cheek, small human things that don't need saving. I held that picture like a shield. The papers in my pocket were no longer just numbers. They were Willie Carter's folded bills, the Johnson Children's Scholarship Fund, the trips the youth group scraped together. They were promises in ink that someone had traded for a private ledger in an island bank. "Give them to the council," Pastor Warren said, and his voice slid the order over the others. In that moment I saw the plan laid bare, address the problem, frame the release, choose who would carry the blame. If I handed everything over quietly, the story might be controlled. If I refused, the story might explode. My hands trembled. The light from the window caught on my wedding band, making it a thin, stubborn coin. I thought of Henry's simple way of saying, "Keep it right." There was no grand courage in him, just a stubbornness about fairness. It steadied me. "I'll read them aloud," I heard myself say. The sound of my own voice surprised me. Steady, plain, without flourish. It cut through the room like a bell. Eliza's shoulders tightened. Gregory inhaled a breath that sounded like prayer. Pastor Warren's eyes flicked away, just for a moment, and in that little falter I read something I had never seen before: fear. When I began to speak, each name and number landed like a pebble dropped into still water. Faces tightened. Some people drew their hands to their mouths. A woman in the back exhaled a long, soft sound that could have been a prayer or a gasp. The room shifted. The control Pastor Warren had tried to keep slipped like sand. By the time I finished, my palms were damp and the lamp switch glowed like a small, accusing moon. There was no immediate eruption, only the slow, cold sorting of people into those who believed the papers and those who needed more proof. The bell tower, which had been a looming threat, retreated in the sky as if we had interrupted some long-standing silence. Outside, someone started to cry. I could hear the sheriff's cruiser finally, distant and steady, like a promise of a different kind of order. I realized then that standing there, with the dust still in my hair and the smell of mortar in my nose, I had chosen to let the truth weigh more than my reputation. My hands still shook, but they were my hands, older, stubborn, honest. And for the first time that morning, something inside me felt unclenched. The conflict had deepened, yes. Faces had hardened and alliances shifted. But the choice to speak had pulled a thread that would not knit back into the comfortable cloth we'd always worn. The town would have to outgrow that fabric or tear it away. I looked at Gregory. He met my eyes and nodded, small and fierce. Eliza folded the papers with a care that might have been pity. Pastor Warren cleared his throat, and for the first time, I saw that priestly steadiness with a crack in it, a human fracture. Outside, the bell tolled once, slow and low, as if marking a beginning. After the council adjourned and the sheriff's cruiser lights winked away down Main Street, I thought the worst would be the paperwork, the insistence of signatures, the long, bright sort of clearing that follows a storm. I was wrong. At first it was small things. A softness in greetings that slid into silence. People who had hugged me for years stepped back as if there were something contagious about the truth. The woman who ran the bake sale, Marta, who used to press a lemon bar into my hand and say, "For you, Margaret," now handed it to me on a napkin and looked at the ceiling while I thanked her. Her eyes never met mine. Coffee hour after church was a test in choreography. Platters moved faster than usual. Conversations folded shut like hymnals. Never have I seen so many hands busy with so little to say. Someone scooped the sugar bowl away before I could reach for it. A man I'd greeted every Sunday for a decade crossed the room with the deliberate purpose of pretending not to see me. "Busy morning," he muttered. and the sentence had the weight of a door closing. Whispers followed me like, Eliza's change felt like a small betrayal because it was so practiced. Where she once smoothed my skirt with a maternal hand and asked about Henry, now she kept a polite distance. Her brooch was the same, needlepoint pumpkin as crisp as ever, but her smile shrank into a professional arrangement. She was careful with her words, offering neutral phrases that had been rehearsed for years in committee minutes. The chair she would pull up beside me at meetings stayed empty. I could see her measuring other people's faces when they looked at me, calculating. It was not cruelty so much as an acute fear of being caught on the wrong side of town gossip. Children stopped running toward me after summer camp photos appeared on the bulletin board. They used to climb into my lap for sticker charts and hugs. Now they glanced at me from a safe distance, the way youngsters glance at something that might be fragile. The mothers pulled strollers between us like shields. One woman crossed the aisle faster than necessary, cheeks warm with the flush of belonging to a group that had decided I was, for now, outside. Inside the church office, the atmosphere curdled into formality. Volunteers who had once popped in for an hour of sorting hymnals now sent emails from their kitchens. Messages that used to be phoned came as short texts, tight and precise. No invitations, no small talk, no shared casseroles. The mail on my desk dwindled. The condolence notes I used to organize sat unread in my own mailbox like small, abandoned prayers. I noticed the practicalities too. The schedule for the centennial celebration, my handwriting across the committee list for years, was revised without my input. Names were removed with quick strokes, as if taking sugar from a bowl. The newsletter that used to print my little notes on birthdays and baptisms omitted my report that week. It felt petty and precise. A hush that had the shape of exclusion. There were harder, sharper things. A woman I delivered meals to after her hip surgery saw me on the sidewalk and pulled her curtains closed, the fabric falling in a soft, decisive snap. A neighbor I'd waved to for 30 years refused to return my wave, staring at his garden instead. Once friendly faces smoothed into the mask of those who must protect themselves by choosing a narrative that keeps them comfortable. Not everyone turned away. Gregory's presence was a small, stubborn light. He still came by with the jangling keys and the smell of oil and rope. He would stand an arm's length away, his smile a mix of worry and resolve. He didn't press. He simply kept showing up, letting me know there was at least one pair of hands that would not fold. When I found him repairing the bell rope late one afternoon, his knuckles white against the frayed fibers, he nodded without a sermon. That nod kept me upright on days when the room of my life felt like an empty hall. But solidarity with Gregory carried its own quiet danger. Others saw his closeness as risk, an inconvenient loyalty. He began to look smaller when he walked into crowds, as if he carried my controversy like a second coat. People who'd once asked after his knee now kept their distance. I could see the toll on him in the way he massaged his left leg when he thought no one watched. The weight of the gossip was not only social. It crept into small economic things that matter to a widow who keeps her bills neat. Invitations stopped coming, offers to share rides were rare, and the few notes that arrived were curt and official. The names of people who had supported the community center for years were whispered like litany. Some defensively, some as accusation. For the first time in decades, I felt the ledger I had kept, the careful accounting of people's generosity, become a ledger turned against me. At night, the house felt unusually loud. The clock in the kitchen ticked with a relentless calm. Henry's old percolator sat on the counter like an artifact, lid dusty. I would catch myself reaching for the phone to call a friend, to dismantle a rumor with a conversation, and then set it down. The phone began to ring less. When it did, voices were clipped and cautious. Once, a neighbor asked if I'd be okay walking to the post office, and then hurried away when I said I preferred to go alone. It is one thing to be bruised by a falling stone. It is another to be eroded by silence. Each morning the bell still tolled, low and steady, marking the hours as if nothing had happened. But the sound had found a new texture for me, a reminder that faith and community are not the same thing, and that being faithful can sometimes mean standing where everyone else steps away. I drink my coffee now with the mug Henry left me. It warms my palms in a way the room no longer does. There are days I think of packing the ledgers, folding up the cardigan, and walking away down Main Street. Then I picture the children in the youth group, the names in the envelopes, the dreams we tucked into that community center fund. The faces in those faded photographs weigh against the coldness of a few turned backs. So I keep showing up. I answer the door when the sun is bright. I straighten hymnals. I wipe the brass until my hands ache. It is slow work. It is steady. And in the echoing quiet between murmurs and slammed doors, I remind myself that truth, like a bell, will have its turn to be heard. The church fills with a sound I feel more than hear. Pastor Warren's voice carrying from the pulpit, low at first, then rising like a tide. It vibrates through the wood of the lectern under my palms, through the floorboards into my shoes. The smell of the polished oak and old hymnals wraps around us, warm and faintly dusty. A candle on the altar gutters, its flame trembling as if it too is listening. I sit with my hands folded. Fingers lace so hard I leave a crescent in my skin. My breathing is a practice thing. In for 4, out for 6. I keep my shoulders rooted to the back of the pew because that is what steadies me, the sensation of being anchored when everything wants to sway. People are close enough that I can smell coffee from the fellowship hour still on someone's sleeve. I can see the micron of dust swirling in the beam of light that falls across the aisle. Friends, Warren says, and the timbre of his voice has that preacher's certainty that used to comfort me. Today it cuts like a proclamation. He frames his words the way he always has, scripture, metaphor, then the turning point meant to guide the flock. Only now his metaphors have a different edge. He speaks of stewardship and temptation as if reading from a ledger of sins and saints. Eliza sits an arm's length away, her hands folded in her lap, knuckles white against her floral sleeve. Gregory stands near the back, his cap in his hands. I watch his jaw work. He looks old in a way that has nothing to do with years and everything to do with what he has carried into this room. The choir's hymnal goes half ignored on the music stand. There's an undercurrent, the small vibrations that travel under a sentence, when you know you're about to be asked to decide. Warren's voice rises. The vibration of it makes the little brass cross on the pulpit shiver. I feel it in my teeth. Then a sound like a hinge, an old door protesting. The side door creaks open and someone comes in late, breathless. And the timing pulls a ripple through the room. It's the kind of creak that announces a change. Heads turn. Conversations stop mid-sip. My throat tightens. He begins to speak of irregularities with the same measured cadence he'd used to read the morning psalm. His hands are calm on the worn leather of his Bible. He asks questions that are meant to place suspicion like a halo, not to illuminate but to shade. The congregation leans forward, collectively holding itself in that fragile balance between faith and the facts laid faintly on the table downstairs. My hands are clammy now. I press my thumb to the knot of my wedding band until the metal bites. Every instinct I have tells me to be small, to fold myself away. Henry's voice is a whisper in my ear. Keep what you know, love. Make it right. The pulse at my throat beats a little faster. My breath shortens, then I force myself to slow it again, the ritual of control. A candle sputters. Its flame dies with a soft, offended sigh. The darkness it leaves is small, but it feels enormous. A murmur passes through the pews like a wind under a door. Someone fumbles for a lighter. The warden rises, but another sound cuts him off. A dull crack from the wall where a small crucifix hangs. It slips free of its nail and falls, the wood striking the floor with a soft, unsettling thud that echoes under the room's hum. For a heartbeat the whole church is suspended, the kind of silence that is a living, breathing thing. You could hear a pin drop in the office. Warren's eyes flick to the fallen cross. And for the first time I see the human flinch beneath his sermon face. He does not say a word. His hand goes to the Bible. He shifts forward, a slight motion that is almost a reach. For a breath he speaks in that low preacher tone that can draw in a room and make even doubt seem like a prayer. "We will not rush to judgment," he says, and every word is a silk glove hiding a claw. Gregory steps forward then, the sound of his keys like a small percussion. He speaks, not with the preacher's polish, but with the plainness of someone who has touched every corner of this old building. "Those numbers weren't meant for private ledgers," he says. His voice is thick with something like mourning. The old custodian's words land like stones thrown into still water. Somewhere, the main door gives a long creak and the sheriff steps in. Not with lights, not with spectacle, just the quiet authority of someone who measures truth by different scales. His presence rearranges the air. People shift. Faces rearrange into attentions and reckonings. Warren's practiced smile thins. He stands then and the hall feels smaller. His sermon voice is still there, trying to steady him, but it rattles on a different pitch. He looks at me. Not the warm, familiar pastor who once handed out casseroles at funerals, but a man calculating what to save. His mouth opens and the confession comes not as thunder but as a crack. "I only wanted security for my family," he says, and the sentence falls into the room like a stone into a pond, spreading sorrow in widening rings. The crucifix on the floor is a quiet witness. The candle stub smudges wax on the altar cloth like a tear. The bell's reverberation seems distant, a memory of the sound that calls us to worship now answering back in a new key. My breath is steady now because I have stopped holding it against fear. My hands are still clasped, not in prayer alone, but in the conviction that I have done what was right. Around us the congregation breathes out in waves, some in relief, some in grief. Gregory's shoulders loosen like a rope finally untied. Eliza's fingers tremble against her brooch as if she's counting the cost. I look at the man who taught me about honesty from that very pulpit. I remember baptisms, casseroles, good counsel. I remember Henry's quiet nods. Nothing erases those things. But truth has unpeeled something we thought unbreakable. When the sheriff speaks quietly into his phone and the murmurs turn into questions, I feel the room change. The music of our routine Sundays has been replaced with a new brittle chorus. The bell somewhere above might toll again. I hope it rings for a different kind of justice. For now, as the cross lies on the floor and the flame has been extinguished, I sit with my hands folded and know the shape of this moment will mark us all. We have been split by a choice, to protect a person or to honor the trust of a town, and the sound of that fracture will not be easy to mend, but it will be heard. And sometimes that is the only mercy left. The sheriff's cruiser slid down Main Street like a quiet promise. He walked into the lobby without fanfare. No flashing lights, no parade. Just the soft authority of someone who measures facts the way others measure prayers. The room shifted when he came in, shoulders leveled, eyes focused. I could feel the congregation rearrange itself into attention, as if the air finally decided which way it would fall. Pastor Warren had the pulpit voice ready, the cadence that smooths a room. But when the sheriff asked the simple, practical questions and the papers were placed on the desk where everyone could see them, the sermon voice splintered into something thinner. I remember how the light hit his cufflinks then, gold catching like a small, accusing sun. He looked small in that moment, not because he had been a giant, but because the ledger numbers were too large to be held inside a practiced smile. He said the words the papers demanded before anyone else forced him to. "I thought I was protecting my family," he admitted. It came out like a tired prayer, laced with something I couldn't forgive and yet could not understand. Tears gathered in his eyes, but they did not wash away the weight of the transfers. They were not the same as restitution. There was no thunderbolt, no miracle. There were, instead, things everyone could see and touch. Bank statements with dates. Transfer confirmations with routing numbers. The little, precise handwriting of responsibility. That is what truth looks like when it is not dressed up in metaphor. Numbers and dates and the sound of a housekeeper's keys jangling as she goes about her work, finding the thing no one wanted to find. Gregory stood with his cap in his hands. He had that look of a man who keeps boilers running and sins from spreading, the practical grief of someone who had loved a building his whole life. When he spoke, it was plain and steady. Those funds were meant for the kids, for lunches, for a roof that didn't leak over someone's head. No flourish, no sermonizing, just the blunt naming of what had been taken. The confession did not erase the shock. People sat back in the pews as if the floor under them had tilted. Eliza's face folded into something like regret. She smoothed her skirt in a motion so small it was almost habitual, and for a moment I saw how much the desire to protect the appearance had outweighed the call to truth. It hurt, that discovery, as sharp as a splinter pulled free. The sheriff took statements. He moved with an economy of kindness. He did not promise outcomes he could not deliver. He collected facts. He listened. There was dignity in that small methodical care. After he left, the room felt both lighter and raw, like skin exposed to a winter wind and somehow still warm beneath. The hardest thing was not the exposure. It was watching people reckon with betrayal. Some faces hardened immediately. Others softened with sorrow. Forgiveness is not instantaneous. It is a long, slow thing that looks more like showing up than like a grand gesture. I understood then that our trust had been broken not only by one man's choices, but by the way we'd placed a single person on a pedestal and stopped looking at the little day-to-day accounts of stewardship. What held me steady was not righteousness or vindication. It was memory. Henry's hands on the percolator in the morning. The way he'd hummed under his breath when the town woke up. The small triumphs. The youth group raising money for a scholarship. The widow giving quarters at a bake sale. Those were the things that had weight. The papers in my pocket were not a weapon. They were a record of promises that belonged to others. After the official things were done, statements given, the sheriff's questions answered, there was a quieter reckoning. The council met in a room lined with oak. People spoke in measured tones. Some names were removed from committees. Some chairs were left unfilled until we could find people willing to take them. The centennial plans, once threatened with the same rot, were put on a new footing. We did not pretend nothing had happened. We rebuilt with eyes open. A month later, the scaffolding came down. The tower was mended stone by stone, the mason's chalk lines visible like the handwriting of repair. The community center fund was reopened with a transparency board on display, with accounts updated by people who were not content with trust alone. We held new meetings in rooms where anyone could ask for ledgers and see them. It felt, at times, painfully bureaucratic but also honest in a way I had to learn to value. The dedication morning was crisp and bright. A new pastor stood at the podium, younger, earnest, and plainly uncomfortable with platitudes. He spoke about service and repair, about the work of a town that tends its own. The bell in the tower rang then, not the warning crack of before, but a deep, steady note that filled the courtyard like a breath. It caught in my chest the way Henry's laugh used to. Gregory stood beside me as the ribbon was cut. He held Henry's Bible in his hands like a talisman, the leather softened by years. His fingers were stained with mortar still, and he laughed, that small, rough sound that makes his eyes crinkle, then wiped a tear away with his wrist. "You saved more than a building," he told me, quiet enough that only I could hear. His keys jingled, the same old music, and it felt like a blessing. People came forward that day with casseroles and awkward apologies. There were hugs that meant something different now. Not simple acts of neighborliness, but attempts at mending. Eliza handed me a folded note, her handwriting a little less practiced, and said, "I'm sorry, Margaret. I should have looked harder." It was not redemption, it was a start. Standing beneath the tower, I pressed my thumb against the wedding band Henry left me. It is a small, stubborn coin of a thing, A promise kept. The cold stone under my fingers hummed with the bell's echo. There is no neat ending. Not for me, not for the town. But truth, once spoken aloud, changes the shape of a place. The bell rings differently now. It calls us to the work of repair, not the comfort of assuming no one would ever fall. And when I stand in the sun by the bell tower, feeling the rhythm of that deep, steady toll, I hear Henry in the space between each chime, and I keep putting one honest foot in front of the other. The morning is brittle, the kind of October light that makes everything look more honest. I stand by the entrance and watch the courtyard breathe. The tower's stones, once jagged with old secrets, are smooth now. A mason's chalk line still ghosts the mortar where they set each rock right. The bell rings low, not the warning crack of before, but a steady, honest stroke that sits in my chest like a metronome. I still carry Henry's scent in the small rituals. The percolator hums on the counter like a tiny benediction. I cup the mug with 2 hands and feel the mug warm through my palms. My wedding band catches the light. Its worn edge is a compass. Some mornings I find myself folding my cardigan over the empty pew cushion where his knees used to press the fabric flat. It's a small liturgy. Keeps me down here present. The community center doors are open most afternoons now. Kids spill out laughing, their voices bright as new paint. There are tutoring sessions, a sewing circle, a lunch table that fills at noon with people who used to sit at home alone. The fund's transparency board sits near the registration desk. Numbers printed plainly, hours open to anyone who asks. Watching it fill, that slow tally of receipts and receipts turned into real things, felt like watching a scar knit. It's not the old skin. It's new skin that can still move. Gregory walks with his keys hanging heavier than they used to. He jokes about arthritis. I tell him it's the building's fault. He still smells of oil and mortar. When he laughs, his eyes crinkle exactly the way they always did. He carries Henry's Bible sometimes, the leather softened by years. He refuses to let me carry it. You did the hard thing, he told me once, his voice rough as rope. Let me hold the book. People come back in fits and starts. Some faces are slow to return. Those who keep their distance like a folded hand. Others have arrived with casseroles and earnest apologies. Eliza's note was a small, careful thing. Her handwriting trembled at the ready edge. I should have looked, she wrote. It was not absolution. It was a bridge with missing planks. She stood near the kitchen last month and handed me a plate with 2 hands. Her smile wore the armor of someone learning to be fragile. The new pastor is younger. He does not wear a practiced smile. He smells faintly of lemon cleaner and nervous hope. He preaches about repair as a verb. He talks less about sin from the pulpit and more about mending, roofs, relationships, ledgers. He wants open hours with the books. He wants people to feel they can ask and be heard. He believes that sometimes faith is the hard work of staring at an error and saying, let's fix this. Sometimes, in the quiet between services, I go up into the tower. The stairwell smells of stone and rope and the faint ghost of mortar dust. I press my palm to a stone and feel the cool roughness beneath my skin. Once that same stone almost silenced my life. Now it holds the echo of a new bell. The memory of that instant, dust and a drum of my heart, still sits in my throat like something I swallow twice a week. It is a scar you can feel but not see. People talk about courage the way they talk about weather, as if it's some outside thing that visits. But courage for me was a step and then another. It was unfolding a piece of paper in front of a room of people I loved and letting the truth land like a bell. It was the small decisions after. Answering the phone, dusting the brass, showing up when an empty chair hollows the room. It was showing my face when some doors stayed closed. We did not move on in a day. Rebuilding is a long, blunt instrument. It takes meetings and ledgers and quiet acts. Repairing the bell rope, posting minutes on a board, inviting a former volunteer back for coffee. It took legal hearings and a sheriff who showed up not to humiliate but to collect facts. It took Pastor Warren admitting something that pierced more than his own pride. Confession did not fix everything. It only began the work. When the dedication ribbon was cut and the center's keys were handed over, Gregory pressed Henry's Bible into my hands. The leather felt like a familiar shoulder. The bell sounded then, deep, full, not triumphant but steady, and some people cried. I did too, and the tears were ordinary and honest. The sound rolled over the courtyard and settled into the town like a promise that wasn't easy and still could hold. There are small reminders tucked into routine now. A boy who used to be shy brings me a paper crane he made in the after-school program. He grins when I pin it to the cork board. Proud that something he folded now lives where people will see it. An elderly man comes by to ask if our soup kitchen needs more volunteers and ends up sitting for an hour, talking about the war and his children's children. These are the slow stitches. At home on nights when the house is too quiet, I stand at the window and listen for the bell. It answers sometimes with one deep note that seems to come through the bones of the world. I think of Henry in the kitchen, of Gregory's steady hands, of a congregation that had to learn to look at its ledgers and at itself. I think of the small folded paper that started all of it and how something honest can demand a price and a repair. Today I walk out of the sanctuary after service. I pause at the empty pew, fingers brushing the knitted cushion where Henry used to sit. My hand lingers on the bend of the wood like someone feeling for a familiar face in a crowd. The courtyard smells like cut grass and the faint resin of old benches. I hear footsteps behind me. People moving away from the church toward their cars, their errands, their lives. They press on, voices thinning into the ordinary cadence of the town. I close the heavy wooden door behind me. The wind comes, soft, almost a hush, and the door makes that small final sound, the catch of wood meeting frame. It is the sound of an ending and the same sound of a beginning. My steps echo on the flagstones as I walk away from the tower. They grow quieter, then softer, then carried away by the wind. The bell rings once more, not to warn but to call. Keep going. After all that noise and dust settled, there were quieter reckonings that kept me awake longer than any meeting or court date. Nights stretched thin in the little house Henry and I had kept together. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked with that same patient rhythm, but it sounded different now. Less like the soundtrack to a comfortable life, more like the steady counting of what had been done and what still needed to be fixed. I found myself back at the percolator more often, hands cupping the warm mug, listening for the bell. It still reached me through the panes of glass, low and round, but the meaning of its voice had altered. It no longer felt like something that could shelter mistakes. It was an instrument of notice. A tool we had learned to read honestly. Sometimes I breathed in the coffee and closed my eyes, and I would feel that morning in the courtyard again. The grit on my cardigan, Gregory's keys jingling, the sudden animal silence after the stone hit. The memory sits in me like a small stubborn pebble. People say faith and community are the same thing. They are not. Faith is what a person holds in her chest. Community is what a town decides to keep in its hands. That afternoon, when I unfolded papers and read numbers aloud, I was not tearing at faith. I was protecting it in the only way I knew how, by making sure promises were kept. That distinction kept me from turning bitter. It steered me toward work, quiet, precise, boring work like posting minutes, checking accounts, making sure receipts added up. Gregory kept showing up. He came with his lubricant smell and his jokes about arthritis, and when he laughed, the sound felt like a small amnesty. He would stand beside the kitchen table as if our solidarity could be set there like a loaf on the counter. People came back in fits and starts. Some hugged me like they used to. Others kept a practiced distance that never quite softened. Eliza's apology arrived in her careful handwriting. It wasn't a grand absolution. It was a bridge with missing planks. It was enough to begin walking. We rebuilt with more than mortar. We rebuilt with ledgers in a public place, with an open board where anyone could see the fund's progress. The new pastor wore his earnestness thin sometimes, And he learned, fast, how dangerous it is to let charisma replace oversight. The dedication of the community center the scar on my throat where fear had closed like a fist is still there. But it isn't all pain. It is a map. Sometimes I press my palm to the bell tower stones when no one is looking. The mortar is still cool, and the chalk line from the mason's work is faint but steady. Stones cannot tell stories, but they remember pressure. I ran my fingertips along the edge and thought of how close a life can be to being unmade, and how a single small step backward can change the course of everything. There are things I miss. Henry's hummed songs while he chopped the day's vegetables. The easy way people used to take in my work without seeing the weight behind it. But there are gifts too. I have found a quieter courage. It isn't the sort that lights a room. It's the sort that brings a chair to a meeting, counts the receipts, and shows up even when the welcome is thin. It looks like Gregory's steady hands on the bell rope, like the children's laughter spilling from the center, like a town that finally learned to look under the rug. The documents in my pocket were not a weapon. They were a ledger of promises, and when I unfolded them, they simply asked to be honored. Standing in that little office beneath the tarnished lamp, I learned that truth has its own gravity. Once you set it down in the light, it changes how people move around you. It does not always make things comfortable. It does not always win friends. But it does make repair possible. When I pass the tower now, I slow my step and listen. The bell rings, and I am always surprised by how it settles into my chest. I think of Gregory's keys, Henry's percolator, the index of names and amounts that belong to everyone. I think of the cold stone and the warm hands that helped me up afterward. The town will never be untouched by what happened. Neither will I. But we learn to measure faith by our actions and leadership by accountability. In the end, the secret I carried in my pocket was not a thing to bury. It was a seed. We planted it openly, and it grew into something neither of us expected. A place where vows are written down and anyone can read them. It is not the tidy justice stories promise. It is the slow, stubborn work of showing up. I listened to a warning that morning, and I chose to keep walking. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.